So this class is, as I said, a combination of three styles of class. So three styles. The American seminar is, well, especially in like a grad school setting, would have you read something substantial and come to class and in a group talk about it, right? And you know, this would be a fairly narrow topic, and you know, often there's like a reading, there's a response paper due every week where you kind of talk about what you read, and then you know, maybe at the end you would either do a historiography or perhaps pursue a research project. It is similar in design to a British style, and specifically Oxford and Cambridge style tutorial. In that setting, there would be very few students, usually, I mean, maybe as few as one, but possibly two or three or four, meeting with their major professor, their academic advisor, you know, the one who holds the key to their future, so to speak, right? They would have a longer reading list than in the American seminar, as a product partly of the British graduate school setting. I did 1 degree there, okay. You know, walk into class and you get a reading list that for every week is like 2 pages long, a bibliography. And then the professor will say, well, this is what, you know, this is the full bibliography. If you read all of that, I will be very impressed or possibly appalled. You know, this is what you should read if you want to know about this topic. So read as much as you can of all of this, right? And then, you know, write something up, come to class ready to discuss it, and then have a major research project that comes out of that, or possibly 2 or 3, depending on the exact design. Okay. And then there's the German model. Now, has anybody taken one of the German professors who's visited here, either Dr. Naser or Dr. Flagler? So in the German system, a seminar would have maybe 2 or 3 classes where you read something in common, you have some discussion, you get some ideas about what the topic is, and then the rest of the semester is devoted to student presentations. So the students take over the teaching of the class at that point, and the presentations would go for, well, a half hour possibly, maybe even an hour, depending on, you know, how, well, the chronological parameters of the class. Okay? And so there would be 2 requirements only, a presentation and then a research paper. So I've tried to mash up those 3. Okay? There will be substantial reading in here, right? You need to plan on a book a week. The class only meets once a week. You essentially read a book a week. Okay? Now there will be stuff in addition to that book, but it will be not optional so much as look at this if you have time, and we will talk about this in class. We will focus on it most of the class, right? The book will be, for the most part, preparing you to discuss, well, we'll discuss the books, and these are mostly monographs. These are mostly secondary sources. You know, it will also prepare you to discuss some primary source material that we will focus on in class. Okay. Now, I've taught a lot of these, right? If that scares you, and I can't tell facial reactions because I can only see a third of your face, right? I think I saw some fear in some eyes here, or maybe disgust, I don't know. I've had students who have taken the exact style of class from me in the past who said, I really didn't think I could do it. I thought you were insane at the beginning of the class. But when I got into the semester, I realized that I actually am more capable of this sort of thing than I thought. I remember one student saying, yeah, now I can brag to all my friends that I read a history book a week, and you know, for 1 class. I feel like I feel much more capable as a student than I did before. You know, so yes, there's a lot of reading, okay? But that's, to learn history is an exercise in reading more than anything else. And reading a lot, reading as much as you can get your hands on. One of the books I assigned to my senior seminar students, not the whole book, but part of it is Norman Cantor's How to Study History. This was written in the 1960s. It's old. And it shows its age, right? But there are some things that Cantor says there that I think are timeless for history students. And one of these is, the minimum that a serious student of history should be reading is a book a week. And like a full book, a monograph a week, right? In grad school, it's a book a day. Right? Now, I didn't read a book a day in grad school, but there were some days where I read 2 or 3. And that doesn't mean read the whole book cover to cover. It means you figure out how to get the information out of that book that you need to get so that you can participate in a substantive conversation. And I intend to teach you the skills necessary to do that. In fact, we'll talk about that later in class. Right? You should not be put off by looking at this massive stack of books. I apologize to your pocketbook, to either yours or your parents. I sincerely do. I've been there. Okay. Semesters where I broke the bank on books. There, you can use interlibrary loan and things, right? If you don't want to buy these things, I totally understand. There are ways of obtaining this. The interlibrary loan service in this library is very good. Right, Maria and others there do a great job. So use that and get these books. Now you have the list, you know when you're going to read them and compare them. If you run into problems obtaining a book, and frankly, if you just come to me and say, Dr. Young, I'm broke, right? I cannot afford this. I have a daughter in college right now. We were just talking about her purchasing books last night. Okay, I get this. And I'm, this whole conversation, I'm feeling for my 9 students in this class. I was thinking about you as that conversation really was. Come talk to me, okay? I don't want anyone to be turned away because of financial needs. So, that said, let's talk about the process. As far as the information goes, this is a 2.5-hour class. You should plan to be here for 2.5 hours. We might not go the full time. I will give you a break. Okay. I've done a lot of 2.5 or 3-hour sessions in class. At some point, you just start to lose focus and have understanding. So, an hour, hour and 15 minutes in, depending on the day, I will give you a break. Take 15 minutes. Free our minds a little bit, right? There's only so much you can do wearing a mask and being confined as we are on campus with going single directions and stuff, right? So, but I will give you a break. Note my office hours. These are on Zoom. I will post the link to that on the announcements on Canvas. And if you would like to meet with me in person, I am here. I'm working mostly from home. I'm coming to teach classes, and that's about it. But I'm willing to meet with you in person if you like, right? So otherwise, it'll be on Zoom. If you hit the Zoom link and you end up in a waiting room for a while, just be aware that I'm probably meeting with another student. I will be there during those hours, okay, unless I announce otherwise. If something comes up, I will let you know that I'm not going to be in my office hours. But I should be there every Wednesday from 11 to 1 and every Friday from 1 to 3. And I can be available at other times. All right. Kim, would you mind reading the course description here?
This course is an experiment of sorts in that it attempts to examine broad historical trends across nearly the entire world over a relatively short expanse of time. Historians of late medieval Europe have identified a long 15th century way to encompass major social and cultural trends between the Black Death and the Protestant Reformation. It strikes me that this long 15th century is a coherent temporal marker that can be applied more generally to world history. After all, the period between, say, 1370 and 1530 witnessed not only the rise and sometimes the rapid fall of great world empires like the Ming in China and the Mongols in Persia and India, the Ottomans in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, the Aztecs in Central America, and the Habsburgs in both Western and Central Europe and the New World, but also the most intensive and sustained contact between major world regions to that point in time. The notion that the modern world began in this era is not new, and it remains problematic, but one cannot ignore the systemic shifts in world history that occurred in this period. This class will grapple with these questions and with diverse social and cultural themes, discovery, empire, racism, humanism, individualism, as it delves deeply into primary sources from and secondary sources about the long 15th century.
Okay, thank you. I know there was a lot. Let's unpack this. So, broad historical trends across nearly the entire world. There is such a thing as comparative history. What do you think that means, and what may be the power or perhaps the pitfalls of comparative history? Any thoughts about what comparative history is?
This is just a guess, but like maybe like cross-cultural comparisons
Mm-hmm.
during the time, and also maybe even bring different historical time periods and try and compare them to
Yeah.
a period of time.
Yeah. Good.
It's, by definition, you're comparing different chronologies in history. You have there multiple different cultures that in many ways are as opposite, as oil and water. But I guess you mentioned the pitfalls of when you look at large historical trends like this. I just came from my post-colonial literature class, and we were just discussing how, trying to impose like your own, or at least primarily like Western derived ideas of historical flows and trends often results in flattening of histories, taking away what makes each of the histories of, say, like the Aztecs, for example, unique to their situation and position in the world.
Yeah. And I recognize that.
So I was very excited about the Camilla Townsend book.
Yes. So, on the one hand, right, to understand history, to do what the anthropologist Clifford here calls thick description in a historical setting, we have to immerse ourselves in that setting. Okay. Comparative history, as Derek says, runs the risk of flattening all of it into stereotypes, into kind of overly artificial categories. Right? Comparative history runs the risk of saying, well, I see this thing happening here, and it's kind of happening over here and here and here, and so we can identify, like, this is a worldwide phenomenon. When in fact we have to be really careful with things like that. Right? We have to perhaps posit or find evidence that there is mutual influence. That if something is happening in China at the same time it's happening in Europe in the same era, that we have to look for linkages between the two. Okay? Otherwise, we have to call a spade, so to speak. I'm probably mixing all sorts of metaphors here tonight. This is a new project for me too. And say, well, this is they're doing these things, or rather, this has happened. There's a simultaneity to this, but not necessarily mutual influence. Okay? And this is one of the things that I want to explore. Right? Can we apply broad historical trends? Can we apply isms to this particular period? For students of European history, the 15th century has been pivotal. After all, this is the period of what? This is the Renaissance. Back in the late 19th century, 1860s, 1870s, there was a Dutch scholar, Belgian scholar, named Jacob Burckhardt, who wrote. Anybody heard the name before? What do you know the name of this? Yeah, it's called The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. Right? And although the title indicates that he's looking for the Renaissance, he's studying the Renaissance, right? What Burckhardt was really interested in was the origins of modernity. He wanted to know when the modern world began. For him, that was the 15th century. And so, he identified everything that we associate with the word modern, and he went back into the 15th century, and specifically into the city-states of Italy, and he found all of it, right? And I put some emphasis on the word found there, okay? Why would I do that? Any thoughts on the problematic nature of Burckhardt's study here?
He was looking to prove his own point and thus make sure he could do so.
Yeah, if you look hard enough and massage the data enough, you can find anything. Okay, the name Eric von Daniken, Windmills of the Gods. Right? This is the guy who believes that aliens are responsible for all of these human innovations. Studies like Mayan art and finds like flying saucers in the Mayan art that they were visited by aliens, and they're the ones who taught the Mayans how to, with written language and their calendar system and all of this, right? So, yeah, you can find anything you want. That's Exhibit A for that, okay? And Burckhardt was more careful, I think, than I'm giving him credit for here, but he was interested in finding modern things and found them in 15th century. Well, there was a response to that. The scholar of the 12th century, an American guy writing 30, 40 years after Burckhardt, found all of those things in the 12th century. He said actually there was a Renaissance in the 12th century, right? And then scholars a couple decades later looked at the Carolingian period and started identifying the Carolingian Renaissance, and pretty soon we don't need to have a rebirth because nothing ever died. And I'm actually kind of in that camp. I don't think things actually die. There's no necessity for rebirth. But there still is some, and so if we look at things in that way, we run the risk of missing what is unique or interesting about the time period itself. But we're still trying to do this broad thing, right? I'm trying to introduce you to all of the potential problems so that we avoid those. Now, I then become potentially guilty of that by taking something that has been applied to European history, that is this concept of the long 15th century, and saying, I wonder if this works for the world. Right? Can we find some coherence in this defined period? Coherence kind of in world historical terms. Okay. Now, have you encountered long centuries before? There are multiple of these. There are many long centuries. By a long century, when we're talking about historiography, we mean that scholars have identified that between, so in other words, not 100 years, but there's a long 12th century, which is actually 2 centuries. It's 1050 to 1250, right? Actually, 1050 to about 1215, so 165 years. That's the long 12th century. If we want to be more specific, we might say 1066 to 1215, because we go from the Norman conquest of England to the Fourth Lateran Council. Right? That's the period I've worked in the most. familiar to me. There's also the long 18th century, which actually doesn't even run the full course of the actual 18th century. It goes from, can you guess, signal dates? 1648 to, you close, 1789, right, beginning of the French Revolution. So the Treaty of Westphalia to the French Revolution, what's that, 141 years, okay? We've got another long century, right? Well, the long 15th century, I think, is lesser known. This would be the period from the, well, it varies. Sometimes the Black Death, 1349, sometimes the maybe lesser known events of the 1370s. Anybody know what happened in the 1370s in Europe? I'd be really impressed if you did. Well, that's in during Black Death, and then there are major, the major Protestantic institutes in Spain, 1391. Well, the major thing that is associated with the long 15th century is the end of, or the beginning of the end of the Avignon phase. Right, so the Pope is taken out of Rome at the beginning of the 14th century, takes up residence in Avignon, which was actually, I mean, you know, you might think, okay, he's under the thumb of the King of France. Actually, Avignon was in papal territory. Right? He's still on his own land, but he's not in Rome. Right? Well, in 1377, there was a pope who tried to go back to Rome and ended up spending 3 years there before he returned to Avignon, and this kicked off a whole sequence of events where the papacy just completely went down the toilet, right? It was a mess, right? At one point there were 3 popes, you know, and we're going to deal with the Council of Constance and all of that. We're actually going to read a monograph on that. Talk about the Avignon papacy and the problems that causes, and really kind of the end of the Catholic consensus in Europe, and you know, the associated heresies that culminate in the Reformation. And so, you know, and then maybe the bookend of this would be 1517, which is what? What happened in 1570? By the way, 1370 is also when these like major heresies like the Lollards in England began, and that's another kind of bookend, or first bookend. What happens in 1517? Really famous. The beginning of the Protestant Reformation. We're down in Martin Luther, magnified theses and all of that, right? Or maybe go to the Council of Worms in 1520. But anyway, that's, you know. Now, my own doctor talk, my doctoral advisor once gave a talk, and I will put this up on the Canvas page because, you know, for the European stuff, this is a really interesting lecture that he gave, and there's an article that goes along with it. But in this lecture he gave at the American Society for Church History back in 2007, something like that, he said, rather jokingly, we have too many long centuries. What we really need as historians are some short centuries so we can get some books done, right? But we're embracing this long 15th century. Now, worldwide, these chronological parameters are, well, may be helpful when we apply them to some other things that are happening. In 1368, for instance, the Yuan dynasty in China is overthrown, and we see the establishment. Now, you may know about the Yuan dynasty. Where was that from? Who were the Yuans? I'm really trying to stretch your knowledge here. But that's what the class is about. The Yuan dynasty was from Mongolia. These are the Mongols. ones who Marco Polo supposedly did. Kublai Khan. The Chinese outgrowth of the Mongols. The Mongols went just about everywhere. Okay? Attacked the Middle East, attacked Eastern Europe, attacked India, but their arguably most successful foray anywhere was in China, taking over and having it actually that lasted for, well, more than a century. The Yuans were overthrown by native Hans. Now, the Hans are a group in China who trace their ancestry back to the ancient world. You may have heard of the Han Dynasty in China, which lasted from 202 BCE to 220 CE. It's contemporary with the Roman Empire, and just as successful and just as large here. Well, the Han said, you know, they're ethnic Han group in China, and they had been the primary drivers of most of the subsequent dynasties, the Tang Dynasty and the kind of, well, between the 5th and 9th centuries, the Song Dynasty between the 10th and 13th. They were ousted by the Yuans, but then the Hans regained control of China and started the Ming Dynasty, beginning with the Hongwu Emperor in 1368. And so, the establishment of what is arguably the, you know, the high, kind of high point, a golden age in Chinese history begins in 1368. It's an interesting coincidence. I'm not saying that, you know, there are a chain of events that kind of create these things worldwide. It just works chronologically. I'm interested to explore that. At the end of the 14th, beginning of the 15th century, there's a great deal of upheaval in the New World, culminating in what's called the Triple Alliance in 1428, where 3 city-states came together, defeated all of the surrounding territories, incorporated them into their newly formed kingdom alliance. Okay, the city-state that rose to the fore of this was Tenochtitlan, the Mexica people, right? And the Triple Alliance is otherwise known as what? Yeah, the Aztec Empire. So that's not a name they used for themselves. That's the thing we got to be careful of. It was a German scholar in the 19th century. It's just about all of the nomenclature starts there. Okay, a German scholar in the 19th century, Alexander von Humboldt, who coined the term Aztec. So nomenclature is off the top.
And their like capital, like technically, I guess, would be modern day Mexico City, right?
Exactly. So, you know, this, and then, you know, the Aztecs are defeated by Cortez when? 1519, right? So it's a convenient chronological marker here. Okay. But that's all, like I said, convenient. Right? The chronology fits in some place. And I could talk about India, I could talk about the Middle East, and so forth, and go on and on. Right? Talk about the Ottomans and some of the dates associated with them. We've got 1453 smack in the middle of this. But I'm not primarily or even very much interested in just these chronological conveniences. One of the things I would like us to think about in this class, one of the things I will be thinking about hard as we look at this, is what sorts of things are put into place that span across different parts of the world, and maybe even come to encompass the entire earth. And so the obvious one here is slavery, which is a result of another rather obvious thing here, and that is voyages of exploration, or maybe more properly called voyages of conquest. And avoidance of exploitation. Because that's often the purpose behind it. Exploration may be a misnomer. And I don't think we can separate these steps. One thing we need to explore here. I don't think we can separate the intent to exploit and enslave from exploration. And so another signal year that occurs in this period, of course, is 1490. And every American sees a little ditty. 1492. Ferdinand and Isabella evicted the Muslim from Granada. Okay. Something like that. I think there's another one. Yes or no. But, you know, the first book we're going to read in this class is this one. The year the world began. Notice the subtitle here that he is doing the same thing Burckhardt, I think, was trying to do. Okay. Where do we find the origins of all these things? Well, 1492 is pretty convenient. A lot happens. But then he, quite responsibly, takes us on a tour of, starts with Spain, and then goes to Africa, goes through the Mediterranean, goes over to Asia, goes to the Indian Ocean rim, right? Goes to the Americas. So, we're starting with a synthetic overview, and we can learn some lessons from this, and maybe criticize it, and see where it goes.
Oh, I was just saying, it might be a different author, but I haven't looked up like 1491.
Charles Mann.
Yeah.
That was on the cutting room floor. It was one I thought about for this class, and I've read it. It's good. The problem is it goes all over the place, right? I mean, you get into it. It's actually more about stuff that happened after 1491 than it is about the 15th century. So, I spent a lot of time talking about monologues and people in North America. The whole thing. He unpacks the Thanksgiving, well, deconstructs, I should say, the Thanksgiving narrative. So we're going to read stuff. Other stuff from this introductory paragraph. World Empire. And the word world is important. This period witnesses more than any period that preceded it, empires that span across multiple regions of the world, and that it incorporates many different religions, many different cultures, many different linguistic groups. Right? I mean, there are examples of this in earlier periods, obviously. Okay, the Roman empires, Exhibit A, and the one you may be familiar with, right? The Han Dynasty in China, there is another. A few others that are perhaps lesser known. Central America, all the way back in the third millennium, with the Mayan, whatever. But the 15th century sees a whole slew. And this isn't even a complete list. I said the Habsburgs here. Okay, you may associate the Habsburgs with Austria, right? Or with facial deformities. Okay, but before they were primarily a Central European empire that eventually stretched over into the Balkans, and the heir of which died or was assassinated to begin World War I and all of that, right? The Habsburgs were also controlled Spain. Scion of the Habsburg emperor, who then presided over the though he's kind of, his reign begins in our period, but extends mostly outside. 1519, I believe. Yeah.
Second tail end.
Yeah. So, and, and another one is Flagler, who was the founder of the Mughal Empire. He achieved his empire by conquest. Again, the very end of it. So, yeah, lots of these world empires, and I want to think about what empire means and what it entails. Specifically in this early modern period, how these empires may be similar to each other in their methods of rule, their methods of conquest, their methods of keeping order, how they're different from each other, right? Can this period teach us something about empire as a phenomenon? I think that it's potentially interesting. The 15th century arguably sees the advent of racial thinking. I mean, this is a contentious point. Some have identified what we might call race or concepts of race before this, even as far back as antiquity. But the 15th century sees for the first time a systematic kind of working out of a racial hierarchy. And one of the key culprits here is the Portuguese, inspired by Prince Henry the Navigator. We're going to read a biography. He seems to be a pivotal figure. The Portuguese, and as American students, if you were taught anything like I was, about the voyages of exploration, this was all about getting to India. Well, this is a historiographic bias that is another way somehow that historians have attempted to elide Africa entirely from the historical lexicon. Prince Henry the Navigator started his school for maritime studies with Africa as his main focus. Why? What was in Africa? Resources. Well, ivory, yes, there was ivory, and ivory was a luxury commodity the Europeans knew about. But that was not the one they were thinking about the most. Which resource were they most of it? Gold in Mali. Yeah, gold in Mali. In the middle of the 14th century, and I thought about talking about this guy too, but I figured we'd deal with him shortly. There was a king of Mali, an emperor of Mali named Mansa Musa, and taken, well, any number of classes for me, you've seen pictures of this guy. Mansa Musa went on, he was a Muslim, so he went on pilgrimage to Mecca. And he took so much gold with him that he brought about a deflationary cycle all along his route that nearly collapsed the economies of these various regions in North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. He really hurt the economy of Egypt, for instance. Yeah. Because he gave away so much gold, or he spent so much gold, that it ceased to have the value that it had previously, and the whole currency system collapsed in Egypt, right? Talk about unintended consequences, okay? Well, yeah, that's Mansa Musa. This guy, and in fact, Mali itself became famous all over the world as the place of gold, right? Forget to talk about El Dorado in the New World. Okay, or let's take up that subject. I mean, the thought was, if there is Mali in Africa, there must be a place in the New World that's similar, right? Mali Mali was the thing people were thinking about. The Portuguese wanted to cut out the middleman. To get gold from Mali into the Mediterranean, what did that involve? What's that?
Going to Mali.
Well, yeah, who went to Mali? Oh, hint, nobody sailed there. Ever. So what do you have to cross to get to Mali? Well, you know, your African geography. You have to cross the Sahara Desert. And so only caravaneers who knew the right routes, and there were some of these, could do that. And they charged a huge markup, understandably, because of the risks involved. Well, you know, we have this would-be new kind of up-and-coming kingdom in Portugal, okay, in the 15th century, and there's this forward-thinking individual, Prince Henry, and he never actually became king. But he decides we can cut out the middleman if we figure out how to sail around Africa and get to that coast. And this eventually, after many more decades, they continue to work their way down the coast of Africa, they finally realized, hey, we could go all the way around Africa and maybe get to India too, because by then spices had become really important commodities. New spices came from, and of course, inspired Columbus. He was going for spices. If I can get from the west and get to Asia, you know, every map says the Ganges River flows into the Eastern Ocean. That's India, right? I can get there. Okay. There may be some other islands out there. We've heard of this place called Chapongo. That's European. That's like late medieval European speak for Japan. Chapongo. Okay. And I might have to hit that first, but you know, I can get to India. Surely Japan and India are just right next door. Okay. So, you know, lots of regions of the world had appeal for the Europeans, and you know, I don't want to be too Eurocentric in all of this, right? Long before Columbus was doing what he was doing, the Chinese got interested in exploring the Indian Ocean, getting down into India, because, again, there were commodities there they wanted, getting over to Africa to get gold, and things like that, which they knew about, right? And so this knowledge of the different kinds of goods that were available in other regions of the world is one of the things that pushed things like, well, the growth of empires and these voyages of exploration/exploitation. The European Renaissance has been identified with words like humanism and individualism. The 15th century discovered the individual. He emerged from, you know, being products of their society and being just parts of a larger machine, not terribly important. Okay? Part of a system that worked beyond their control. One of the key metaphors used in the late Middle Ages is the wheel of fortune. Human beings do not control their own destiny. They're part of forces that are much greater than they are. God is the author of all of this, and you know, we can do little except God's will. There are figures in the 15th century. We're going to look at one a little bit later today who seems to evince an awareness of something that we might call the individual. I was about to say that this was totally absent in previous thinkers, but there's something really compelling about a Petrarch or about an Erasmus or one of these. So, you know, we want to think about that too. Just to make sure that we are all on the same page. What is the primary source? Yeah, source that comes from the time period, the events and stuff. Now, we're still in the pre-modern era, which means that mass media, mass communication is not really a thing yet, except what gets developed in the mid-15th century. The printing press. So actually we are at the beginning of the era of mass communication. There were more books produced in the second half of the 15th century than there had been in all of human history up to that point. Meaning more physical copies of books were produced in that 50-year period than had been previous 5,000 years. Let's talk about another kind of revolution that happened. Notice on the block. So, something we want to I did not put Gutenberg as a possibility for presentation. I may have to have that one. Any questions about the course description? All right, well, let's talk logistics, because you really want to know what you have to do. Okay. Learning outcomes are pretty simple. Right? You're going to learn about the period. You're going to analyze primary and secondary sources. What's a secondary source? I didn't ask that. I should have. Yes, technically, but we normally apply the word secondary source to what? To do what? Right. Yeah, it's a scholarly study. It's an analysis of the primary. When I design 400 level classes, I try to have a mix of primary and secondary. But given that my assumption was, and I hope this is correct, that very few of you, if any of you, know anything about China, or India, or the Middle East, or Africa. Have you taken an African history class? You took pre-modern. We'll talk about Mali and Songhai and those things.
I'm taking politics.
Right.
Taking a couple of rounds.
Okay.
There's Asia right now, actually.
Good. Yeah.
And there's a great deal of that. And then this summer I took one of Benham's courses. It's more modern stuff. Past our time.
Where did you take South Africa? Okay, so that's later. Right. I mean, we're not going to talk about Southern Africa. So yeah, I felt like tipping it toward the secondary sources in terms of what you're assigned to read was going to be the right choice. That's why I plan to have primary sources that I make available, but are not necessarily required. You know, I'd appreciate it if you could take some time to look them over, skim them, at least know who the author is or what it is before you come to class, but your assignments are going to be mostly on these secondary sources. There are a couple of primary sources that are longer that I will have. What the hell?
Yeah, I'm like,
That's not right.
I'd love to read it.
What the hell?
It's right
Yeah, I
on your
was like,
map, on your timeline, it's just not right on that.
That is
So your
huge,
timeline.
huge oversight. I am so sorry. Don't look at that list. I'll get there. Okay. And then, you know, critical thinking, reading, writing. Okay. So let's go to the daily schedule to talk about what we're going to read. I will go in and change that before I leave campus. I'll try to do it. That was for the last 400 level class I taught, which was late medieval culture, specifically. I was looking mostly at Dante and at Hieronymus Bosch. Those were like bookends of class. So it was great. I loved it. I'm sorry.
Now that you bring up what your thing was, wasn't it the, I'm trying to remember what it was.
Okay. I'll go back to the rest of
It's the final paper.
Yeah, the final paper.
That's what it's
12 to 18 pages.
If I had my mask off, you'd see me blushing right now.
Yeah.
I'm really embarrassed.
Based on primary sources relating to athletes in the work with
Sounds like school, notebooks are done from Bosch. I'll wing it.
No,
20
that's
pages
not
on-
it. That's
20
not it.
pages on Bosch, yeah, easy stuff. Right.
We are going to look at art, so, first book is this. Now, I realized, so there was actually something rather fortuitous that happened. Okay. I did not realize, because I just wasn't paying attention, that we have Labor Day off. Like, campus is closed on Sunday. Which means we miss a whole week of this class. Right? I won't tell anyone that your contact hours are probably lower than the acceptable threshold in this class. Okay. But yeah, we're not meeting again for 2 weeks. We're meeting this far into the semester, and then you got 2 more weeks. I thought about being the cruel professor who said, I don't care if we're meeting, you still have an assignment that week. But then I realized I was assigning you a lot already, and I didn't want you to have torches and pitchforks in the next class. So I rethought that. But the fortuitous thing was, I had ordered this book on Tamerlane. Tamerlane was the Timurid dynasty, Central and East and South Asia dynasty in the 14th century. Tamerlane is a tremendously important world historical figure. He is the head of one of these region-spanning empires. I wanted you to read about Tamerlane. And the bookstore said, that book is out of print, we cannot get it. I said, that's okay, I can make it work. I can, like do scans of it for my students or whatever. But then I realized we actually have one less class, and so I excised the Tamerlane book entirely from the labs. That said, I will give the first presentation on Tamerlane. I will read that book, okay? I will be the intrepid one who does the extra assignments, right? So that's why the first presentation is on Tamerlane. I'm going to take that. Yes.
So yeah, I was reading the syllabus, so each of us are going to have our own presentation each week.
This is the German system.
Right?
Yep.
How
Is that a problem, Shelby?
No, not at all.
Good with that? Well, what I mean is he's assigning more stuff. Americans tend to have like smaller assignments and more of them, and Germans tend to have like really big assignments and only a couple of them.
They were fairly big assignments. They were their only assignments, and then you had one paper.
Right. That's still a difference.
You had 2 seminars you give, and then a paper there, and not one of the 2.
Okay, so the first book we're reading is this one, right? 1492. This is our synthetic overview. Okay, 1492, obviously a pivotal year, and so we'll take a look at this, talk about it, we'll see if this works, see if what Fernando Ernesto is doing is valid, helps us think about this. Then we're going to talk about Ming China. Now, there are 2 possible presentations, and these are the 2 early Ming emperors who were arguably the most important of the entire dynasty, at least in the early years. The dynasty itself lasts almost 300 years. So, the Hongwu emperor is the founder of the dynasty. The Yongle emperor is seen as the second founder, or the re-founder. Because after the Hongwu's rule, there was some dissension and kind of fell apart for a few years. And then the Yongle emperor comes in and re-founds. Yes.
So we just don't know their names. They just
Oh, we know their names, but all Chinese emperors have a title.
Yeah, I know nothing about
That's just that. Yeah, that's how.
I know enough about Japan. But not enough about that.
You know that they just have these titles.
Oh, that was my question. Yeah, that was my question. I didn't know if it was a family name.
No, it's these.
The family name is
Hong Wu started out as a peasant, actually, but this means like the the militant one or something like that. I mean, it's a pretty generic. It's like a superhero name in some way. I mean, these could be Marvel characters. I am trying to obtain, there is a 2-volume set of main sources in translation. I'm trying to get my hands on that to give you some primary sources, but again, this would be extra readings that wouldn't necessarily be required, but we will be giving some of them in class. Then we're going to really shift gears. So we're going to kind of be jumping all over the world at the beginning of this, right? So, and I've tried to go somewhat chronologically. Now, I will say this, the Lavatas book has to do with what I see as the most interesting component of early Ming history. And these are the voyages of exploration into the Indian Ocean commanded by the Admiral Zhang He, who was, among other things, a eunuch. I spent a lot of time recently reading about eunuchs in China. Fascinating topic. The Hongwu Emperor, when he began the Ming Dynasty, China had, for a long time, going all the way back to the Han Dynasty, been governed in large part kind of bureaucratically by these Confucian officials. Well, the Hongwu Emperor elevated the palace eunuchs to serve as a kind of bulwark against the machinations of the Confucian scholars. Right? And so the eunuchs come to have a tremendous amount of power, and they often are, these scheming courtiers. They just lack certain equipment, right? So, but that actually makes them in some ways more formidable because their motivations are more hidden. It's not like to support their posterity because they'll draw through. So anyway, Zhang He was a eunuch, but he still was able to command the largest treasure fleet, I would say, previous to the 20th century. There were hundreds of ships. The largest of which were, the largest fish was 134 meters long. You can imagine a boat built in the 15th century that was like a football field and a half long, okay, and 54 meters wide. This is practically a city floating under wind power, on the ocean. And for whatever reason, the Chinese just up the head of this. That's one of the things that I want to try to sort through. Second book will be it's called The Battle for Christendom. This is about the end of the Avignon Papacy and the Council of Constance. And one of the key figures in all of this is a guy named Jan Hus. The Bohemian heretic. He was, yeah. Anybody been to Prague? That's at the beginning of the 30s, 17th century.
It's really armored.
We have a picture of my older son at the defenestration window in the Prague Castle. My older son is holding my younger son, acting like he's pitching him out of the window, and my wife is like this. It's one of my favorite pictures. All right, so anyway, the defenestration Prague. To defenestrate somebody means to what? Throw him out a window, which happened. They landed on a pile of shit. I mean, it was great. They actually survived. It's quite a drop, but it's a good thing manure piles just laying around in the 17th century can save you if you get thrown out of a window. But Jan Hus was not thrown out of a window. He was burned to the stake. And there's a big monument to him in the town square in Prague. So hopefully someone will be interested in giving a presentation on him. He's really interesting. Then we're going to read this book that won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, both. Stephen Greenblatt's The Swerve. which is about some lesser known things in the early Italian Renaissance, right? Some shifts in sort of scholarly or intellectual approaches. He's interested in some anecdotes that kind of get into this swerve, as he sees it, to a new way of thinking. In addition to that, we want to think about some of the other things that are happening kind of politically and intellectually in the 15th century. If anyone wants to give a presentation on really salacious stuff, you should choose the Borgias. Shelby, do you know something about them?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Isn't there a series about them?
Yeah.
Several? Okay. Well, let's not do the television stuff. Let's, try to read some things about them. But yeah, if you want to get into sex and violence and control of the papacy, right, then the Borgias are your crowd. The other possibility here would be Joan of Arc. Someone likes to do that. She's interesting. But we're going to look at some Renaissance art, but comparing the Italian with the Northern Renaissance. And the most complete book I've seen, and this is probably the most expensive, my apologies. It's like $60. You're like, yeah, it is. That's how much it is. Truly forms the new art of the 15th century. It's a beautiful book. It really is beautiful. Yeah.
Is there any way, like, if we know a good bit about other Renaissance artists that could relate to it, is there any way if we decide to do a presentation that we could
Of course.
do a different artist?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I put Da Vinci on there because he gets at a lot of the themes that I'm interested in for this, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, if you wanted to do someone else, you want to do Raphael or Donatello or someone like that, right? That'd be possible. And you could do another Northern Renaissance figure too. You could do an artist, right? You could do Van Eyck. Or Hieronymus Bosch. He's my favorite. Well, I taught a class on him. You do, yeah. So, no, you don't. Then we'll talk about the conquest of Constantinople, right? Jonathan Harris is the end of Byzantium.
All my chips in on all black.
But because the Ottomans were taking over, not just Constantinople, but also the Balkans, there was a rather interesting 15th century figure there, Slavic guy, who had a habit of running spears through people and possibly sucking blood from their necks, right? The legends come down to us. And so, if you want to do a presentation on historical Dracula, here's your chance. Okay. I was thinking about a biography of him, but it ended up on the cutting room floor. Right? He's not important enough, for our purposes here to go that far. But if somebody wants to do a presentation, it's more than welcome. You can only have one of them. Okay, so we may need to fight over that. Kate. What's her last name? She's blind.
Oh, I know Kate.
She knows more about Vlad the Impaler than like any living person I've ever met. So I'm surprised she's not in this class. She knew that I was doing that in this class. She would have kept calling. So anyone would have got to see like between a blind woman. Kate's pretty formidable. I don't think I'd want to mess with her. Derek, yeah.
Well, if you don't mind me asking, what's the biography?
It was a fairly recent scholarly biography.
Part of my senior tenure.
Okay.
Not that it has anything to do with this history at all. Like I've read a bunch of stuff in the blog. You're right, really interesting.
And Suleiman is arguably the most important of all of the Ottoman sultans, at least the early Ottoman sultans. Mehmet, we're going to talk about him in class, and so Mehmet was not the presentation's trying to get you beyond what's in the monographs, right? So primary sources will be on Mehmet. I've got those already, right? But Suleiman is at the he, like Babur and Charles V, is at the end of our period, right? He only begins his reign within our period and extends beyond that, but he's important enough that I'm willing to look at kind of the results of some of the things we're looking at.
So just that brings up a good point. For anyone, I guess, doing, since it's more important towards the very end stage, like how would you, in the structure of the presentation, would you focus more about the stuff just prior to his ascension, or would you be allowed to go beyond the confines?
Oh, of course, yes, you would. I mean, he reigns till 1566, right? I mean, it's obvious that you would need to go beyond the confines.
I wasn't sure.
But I want, with all these presentations, I want you to identify how these figures are indicative of some of the trends that we're discussing. And in Suleiman's case, in Charles V's case, right, it would be, how does this carry forward and what changes beyond the period of our inquiry? Okay. Do you have another question?
I remember talking to you a while ago about having
It's on the books. I've taught it once. I'm probably never going to teach it again.
I won't be here. So
Mostly because I just have too many other courses and it just doesn't fit in the rotation anymore. So I'm going to have to excise it. I mean, I taught that thing last like 2013, so it's obvious that it's just not there's no service for it. Now we need to cover Africa too, okay, specifically the Songhai Empire, and the late Mali and the early Songhai, Soni Ali Bear, and especially Askia Muhammad, who's a really important figure in West African history. But the presentation topic would be Mbemba Nzinga. Anybody ever played Civilization 6?
I was about to try and like flex my knowledge real fast about him, and then I was like,
he is on there, right? Love that guy.
It's a weird Civ.
I've never played as him, but I mean, actually, the whole thing about if you guys have no idea what we're talking about, then my apologies. It's a video game, right? In the video game, one of the things they do that's really creative is they have him. He insists on like all the other religions coming in and converting his people because Congo can't produce its own religion, right? And so you get points if you play as Mbemba, and if you like go and convert his civilization, right? But he also, if you play as him, you get power if you get converted. Right? He's the one who is most friendly to Christianity. In the Congo, beginning of the 16th century, right, converted to Christianity largely because of his machinations. He's also known as King Alfonso I of Congo. Okay, so if you want to stretch yourself a little bit into Africa, this would be a good presentation. Then we'll, after looking at exploration in other places, kind of end up back in Europe, talking about the European voyages. But as they also impact other places, and as other places impact what Europe's. So we'll start with Prince Henry the Navigator, which will get us in more even into African history as well as India, right? And then we'll take a break from that and do the Aztecs, okay? And I've got you reading a full monograph on the Aztecs, the one that I think is the most respected of all of the monographs, like single volume histories of this, right? Pretty accessible. I'm also going to have you read some parts of the Broken Spears, which is the Aztec account of conquest. And then, some primary work, some primary material from Christopher Columbus himself, because he is very much a product of this age. And then finally, voices from the end of our period, and the major one is Babur Nama, which is more. Probably won't read the entire thing, so I'll excerpt that more. If you've seen the side of the book. Well, there are lots of different editions of it. And this is a modern library version. Yeah.
I was going to bring up I spoke that one with research. probably because I ordered new Fifth Sun and I ended up yanking. And then I bought the Swerve one. They have tons of copies.
Yeah. Right. Anybody else not have 1492 yet? I didn't know what the correct book list for this course was, so I just sort of took that. I haven't used the bookstore, and I happened to the bookstore experiences I had with it.
It's been a lot better.
The new one should be better.
Oh, I imagine it is.
Except they still have, I mean, I ordered books weeks
Yeah,
ago, and they're still
Yeah,
getting
there's like
back ordered.
I found a free PDF of the book.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Is it the whole thing? Please share. Okay. Yeah, seriously. I mean, that saves me from having to scan the whole darn thing, which I was not looking forward to doing. All right, so fantastic. Copyright laws be damned. Fine with that. Oh wait, I'm being recorded. This is going to go on the internet forever. You should always obey copyright laws.
Parody, hypotheticals. Hypothetically speaking, were you to share in total theory?
There are 3 parts to your grade in this class. One of these is not a paper on Dante or Bosch. Okay. Every week, you need to write a short response paper. I mean, I put 1 to 4, but I don't expect you to write 4 pages every week, okay? I mean, you know, and that's why I also put 1, right? This needs to be a reaction beyond merely, I liked it or I didn't like it, right? I want you to interact with the ideas in this book. You don't need to give a summary of it. In fact, if that's all you do, you really haven't done what I'm asking you. Okay, so you don't have to give a summary. Right? If you find like one concept or one anecdote or something that you find particularly interesting that helps you think about this period and about the themes of the class, you can spend your entire paper writing about that. Right? I want to see evidence of real thought, real interaction. I don't want to see summaries of the book. Does that make sense? Okay. I mean, certainly these are monographs, most of them. There are a few primary sources in there, Palanama and Columbus and stuff like that. But you know, you can identify the argument and the methodology and the bias of the author and things like that, right? And that's a perfectly valid way to react to the paper. Talk about how this, you know, why this is a good argument. Not just it is a good argument, but why it's a good argument. Why the methodology is compelling, or why the author's use of sources are good. How the bias gets in the way, or how, you know, this is actually helpful in thinking about, you know, ways to approach this topic, or, you know, whatever it is, right? But you don't have to do those things either. You can kind of delve into the ideas of the subject matter if you want. Okay. In other words, there's not one right way to do this. I want to give you some freedom here, and you know, I will be happy to reel you in if you kind of go astray. So,
I was just asking, do you want it just on Canvas or do you want also a paper copy?
I'm trying to go as paperless as I possibly can. Class participation. I mean, there's only 9 of us in here. I think all of you have made a comment today, at least one. That's good. Keep it up. Keep doing what you're doing. You're going to be just fine with it. And then on the other hand, if you just sit there and never say anything, that's obvious you're not prepared. Then no promises, right? I'm not going to
fail you necessarily, but 40 out of your 100 points of the participation grade are the presentation. In other words, that's, like 50% of your grade. Right? So take this seriously. 25 to 30 minutes. This is substantial. If you walk in and give a 5-minute presentation, you're not going to pass this. Right? I mean, I try to be merciful, but, that just doesn't cut it. And I'm not going to sit there with a stopwatch and say, oh, you were at 24:57, you didn't do it. But, I want this to be a substantial presentation. The topics we've already seen. These are mostly key individuals from this period who are covered either not really or only obliquely in the stuff we're reading, but they're still important. Right? Like Tamerlane, who I'm going to do, right? It's really important to think about the early part of this period, but I just couldn't fit in the book on it. So I will do that presentation. Hopefully that will give you a sense of what you need to do with the presentation there. Yeah. So when I grade presentations, there are two criteria. One is your presentation itself. Is it well organized? Are you articulate? Does it make sense in terms of like progression through different themes, right? Or are you just all over the place? Okay. Are you required to have a PowerPoint? Not necessarily. Okay. And I would say if you use PowerPoint as a crutch, it's going to hurt more than it's going to help. Meaning one thing, and hopefully you've learned this already, not going to be aid to you in all of this, okay? If you put all your text on the PowerPoint and you sit there and read the PowerPoint, that is like the worst presentation style that I can imagine. Other than babbling incoherently, which I've also seen, right? I'm pretty sure I had a senior seminar student show up to his presentation, end of the year, end of like college career presentation, stoned one time. I'm almost certain this happened. This was many years ago. All he did was babble. I mean, just like he'd start with a thought and then he'd stop and like look like he was completely lost, and then he would start talking again on something completely different, and that was the entire presentation. Right? So, that was the worst presentation I've ever seen. Okay, if you do better than that, then you're at least got somebody beat, right? But don't read your slides. Okay. With these figures, right? I mean, we want a biography in a sense, but as I said before, I also want you to try to connect with the kind of these major themes or historical trends of the course, right? What can we learn about empires of this period from this figure? Right? How do they take part in this move toward kind of regions coming together? How are they contributors to that, or even kind of pioneers? And I also want you to take us through some primary sources. Okay, so this is not just a presentation, it's also a teaching opportunity. Now that said, you shouldn't get lost. I mean, you shouldn't spend 28 minutes on like a single primary source and not tell us anything about the person or the question. But you should have some primary sources. Okay? In a way, this is like giving a conference paper or the senior seminar presentation, because you're going to have kind of an argument, and you're going to use the primary sources to help teach what you're arguing. Like I said, it's not the high pressure that would have. Right? But a good part of the grade is this. Any questions about presentation? I mean, we can say more about this later, but I'll give the yeah.
Do you want it to integrate it with a discussion session, or is that an interactive?
Yeah, I mean, you can. Absolutely.
I think that'd be
Yeah, I mean, I would say that when you deal with the primary source, maybe you want to ask a question or two of the rest of the class. I'm not going to absolutely require it, but I think it's a good idea. Okay, I mean, I don't want to like give you a list of things you have to, a long list of things you have to do in the presentation. I want you to have some freedom to do that, but this might be a really key part to your presentation. You have a compelling primary source. Don't try to do too many. But if you've got a representative primary source or two that, you can become a teacher and have some interaction with the other students. The key to that is asking good questions about it. Read something really juicy, and then ask a good question that inspires some conversation. It says 25 to 30 minutes, and I don't necessarily want us to think outside of that, but if the conversation's good and you end up going over a little bit, that's fine, right? If the conversation's good, don't push it off. And then a final paper. Now this paper is not on .8, it's on, something to do with what we cover in this class.
Still
Well, this is a seminar paper, meaning you have to produce an argument that answers a research question, and it uses primary source evidence to back that up. Yeah.
And can we kind of like run by our research question with you
Of course. But if you don't do that, that's not a good idea. So make sure we can talk about it in class. You should, of course, incorporate secondary sources. You may have to do some outside research.
Can we use the ones that we use for
Of course.
the
And that might be enough, depending on what kind of question you ask. I want to get some books, more articles, and relevant. I would hope that this is typical for a 400 lecture class. Senior seminar is not the only place where you have to write a research. It's maybe the most substantial place. Some of you have already done that. You could pass them. Yeah, this is research. I can think of at least half a dozen classes I took in undergrad where I had to do this very thing. I hope that you have at least a few opportunities. I don't think it's your major complete unless you have to. All right. Questions about the assignments? That's it, yeah.
What about the requirements for like the book review? I saw that was so like doing like a formal book review.
No, okay, so I put there, on the syllabus, I put my guide to writing a book review. And I put my suggestions for primary source analysis. Those are to help you with the reaction data.
Okay.
You don't have to do a full formal book review by no means. That's just to help you think about how to respond to the monitor. Instead of
Sorry, so what time are like other reaction papers do the book on?
Yeah, because I want you to have to do this before we come to class. So that we do it 4 p.m. on Monday. Next week. On Labor Day, you should be laboring away at the first book. Or doing something else besides laboring. Okay, let's take a break for 10 minutes or so, and then I want to talk about a few primary sources to get us started.
How you doing?
Oh, good. Other than I'm embarrassed about the things on my syllabus.
You don't need to be embarrassed. We're in a state of craziness. craziness right now
Yeah.
in the world. I'm guessing that as the semester has already started, independent studies needed to have already been fleshed out by now.
I think so. Yeah. Are you thinking about something specific?
Well, just so my entire life was in a state of flux up until just now. Like basically, like I just moved. I'm still moving into a new house as the semester is beginning. So my life has been crazy. So I remember way back in the day, I emailed you like, hey, could we do an independent study this coming semester? Because I don't know what all the classes I want to take are based on what's offered, probably in like Latin or something. And then you were like, yeah, just do that form, fill that out, and let me know, and we'll get that all figured out. And then I was like, okay, well, with this pandemic, I don't know if I want to try and do an independent study. And then now I'm back at the point where I don't have 15 credit hours, and I'm like,
okay.
crap, I can't lose all this.
Well, I mean, the ad drop deadline is
the 4th. So
this week, right? So you've still got.
Is it your last semester?
no, I've probably got 2 more, honestly.
Okay, that's because I had the same problem that I got that email today. I think if it's like your last semester, they'll approve it like if it's not your last semester, it just depends when you're graduating. Because I filled out the little whatever they call it. It was like
Whatever.
whatever it was. I filled that out and I talked to the advisor. And they were like, yeah, since it's your last semester, they'll approve it.
I might just have to jump into some random course.
You're gonna graduate within the 4-year time.
The thing is, I'm planning on taking an extra semester anyways, because I'm not, after taking half of my schoolship being a graphic design major, and then suddenly deciding, no, actually I'm going to study history, I currently am not comfortable taking the master's exam with what I know of history, seeing as I just said ivory was the main reason the Europeans wanted to go into Africa for a second, completely forgetting about gold and all that stuff, which I knew about, actually, because of civilization. No, I'm just gonna have to find a random class to jump into.
Well, ancient Greece is.
No, it's full.
Is it?
Yeah,
Are you sure?
I just checked. I was just looking as you were finishing up talking about presentation.
I'm actually surprised
If you
at that.
if you can get me into
I
there, I'd love
can't.
to be in that
I
class.
can't.
Professor.
It's at max capacity in the room, I think. So, any other semester, no problem.
I know.
So, yeah.
There's like 1 seat left in Introduction to Russia, which I might just jump into.
That would be a really good class.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I do not know Professor
They're really
Flagler, and I
good
hate
class.
jumping into a professor's class a week and
Oh,
a half into the
she's
semester.
she's fantastic.
Yeah. Introduction to Russia, there's 1 seat left apparently.
Do it. For Russian classes,
Yeah.
I'm really good.
Just go for it.
I just hate, like, I already had to drop 1 class and jump into another random class already once, because
syllabus for
I had an online, with the whole shuffling of everything, all the, like, classes jumping into online, like, when I made my schedule, all my classes lined up fine. And then I had one that was online and one that was in person at the same time, and I hate not being able to show up for meetings of one or the other. So I had to drop that class.
Well, yeah, that'd be a good one to get into.
Well,
I
I
think.
just jumped in there.
So, yeah.
Hopefully I have not missed too much of importance in the first 3 sessions.
What about like a religion class or something?
I'm already in Gospel of St. Francis,
Oh, yeah.
which is exciting.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that.
Right.
I mean, that's all I just needed 1 more course.
Okay. That's my suggestion at this point. So I think that at this point in the semester, trying to.
Especially with it being.
Well, I mean, if you've got, look, Reese, if you've got a topic in mind, and you want to like write up what you're thinking about, and we can talk about independent study. That would.
I mean,
it would be possible.
It's not like necessary because I do want to do at least 1 independent study with
Yeah,
you before
yeah.
the end of
Well,
my
you should.
time here. But as I said, I might be taking an extra semester just to get a little bit more languages under my belt because I'm not getting any this semester, which sucks. I'm just going to have to practice
really?
French and Latin or something through like Duolingo.
Are they
or
not
something.
offering anything?
No. Well, the only French one that's being offered is 201 and I haven't done 102 yet.
Oh, shoot. That sucks.
Yeah. And Latin is not a thing, so there was no languages I could do this semester.
You know, we could do an independent study on Latin.
Which is what I suggested originally.
Well, let's do it. We can do that.
Are we allowed to at this point?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Are we allowed to add? I didn't know if you
Yeah.
could add courses.
Yeah, I
as
can
opposed
add
to
that.
the-
I've done that before. I've already got a syllabus.
Okay.
That's no problem.
All right, I've already got
Okay.
one textbook on it. I don't know if it's the one you want.
Well, I think that, so how much Latin have you done?
Basically, I mean, I did 2 years of it in high school through virtual school, so I basically
Okay.
forgot all of that, and then I did 101 last semester.
My suggestion would be, well, we can approach it one of two ways.
Mhm.
We can do either the, like, really intensive, which would be, given what you're interested in doing, maybe the best idea, or we could do, like, the primer of ecclesiastical Latin, which I really like. And
Ecclesiastical
specifically,
Latin
it's specifically good for studying medieval Latin. Right?
which is
So-
what I would be studying.
Right. So either way, I mean, you know, I know both of those primers, and they're both really good. And so, yeah.
So should I just go drop the class I just added, or what do you think?
Well, we've got it. I'll have it as a placeholder. We've got until Friday.
Yeah.
And you know, let's let me. You need to obtain
the
a
form.
independent study form.
Yeah,
Right.
it
And
just
so-
has to be printed out. I just need to go to the library
Mhm.
before I leave tonight and print it out. And that was the other thing, like the professor has to like sign it and stuff.
Yeah.
And since I had no way of contacting you during a pandemic in the middle of the summer, like I think I sent you an email at one point that you just never even responded to.
I'm sorry. I actually was traveling quite a bit.
It's not a big deal. I'm just,
Yeah.
it was like, I basically gave up on the idea of an independent study.
I think Kim emailed me this summer too, and probably never got a response. So my apologies there, Kim.
No, you're good. I figured. I was like, it's not a big deal.
Your query was entirely valid and very generous. I just
I
that was
still have it all together. Like, I got
Okay.
all the paperwork from everyone at the end of the
Yeah.
semester.
what I've told others who have asked me about it is, you know, give me to the end of this week, and I'll try to get something going with Alpha Theta.
There's a lot of stuff that was left undone.
Yeah,
That's
I know.
why I'm
So
just
yeah, I
like,
need to get inducted into that whenever, however
Yeah, you
that
do.
works.
So we can do that this semester.
I believe everything is fine. Maybe not. Who knows?
I worked on putting it onto an Excel file, so maybe it'll be kept a little more organized.
Fantastic.
You know, I am still upset about that conference to this day.
Oh, that it got
I
canceled.
still lose sleep at night over that.
Well,
My mother and I were talking, and she was like, "You haven't made enough use of your college years. Like, you haven't done any internships or anything." I'm like, well, I was supposed to do multiple conferences this last year, and then that didn't happen.
Yeah.
So,
right.
and she was like, "Yeah, I remember now. I guess you tried, but then this pandemic just screwed everything."
Oh, no, I'm just thinking. Oh, I forgot. It's just 'cause I remember you in oral history, and then I was like, yeah, I honestly just took that class to devote it.
Yeah.
And then I did a public history class, so I was like,
Like,
alright, no.
I'm technically a liberal arts major.
Yeah. I've had you in like 3 or 4 classes by now.
Yeah. You and me, all the time.
I think one History of my minor. I almost forgot I had it. Yeah. I'm an international student, but it's poli sci.
All right, I changed syllabus.
Thank you.
It's trying to upload.
That good old Flagler way.
I can't get on the Flagler
Did you pass it?
Yeah, I changed it. I put the new one in.
Did you what happens when you try to get on?
It just tells me I'm failing.
Have you
Like
tried
in
opening
life?
Makes sense. Why does that link just connect with It does.
Yeah, how are they getting away with this? Such awful Wi-Fi. No, especially when you have to pull up the app and you're doing the class.
Well, yeah, and the fact that everything is online too. Yeah. That we have an emphasis on.
Xfinity was supposed to send our house like a new upgraded box that's gonna help us all, and I'm like,
I just want to say, don't blame the IT folks because there are like 5 people in the IT department at Flagler College. Okay. They are so under-resourced and understaffed. Okay, I mean, well, it's probably more than 5, but it's not very many. And those guys are just like, you see them and they look stressed, you know, and it's, I have all the respect in the world for the IT people here, so, you know, it's, that's a tough job at this place. There's a lot that they have to do. I am frustrated that the source that I want to look at is not pulling up here.
Maybe you should apply to do the other.
Wow, this is better.
Have you tried turning it on and off again? Look, it's a different issue now, at least. The issue changed. Alt F4. Oh, but this is a map. I actually
It
don't
came
know
up
anything
on
about
my
maps. This
site.
is above my pay grade.
Yeah. Maybe it just doesn't.
I'm just like,
This course is no longer
You're the one
unpublished.
place that the student doesn't want to travel to.
I mean, your own fault. It's a game map, so.
Yeah, don't tell them that.
Maps suck. I'll fight every Mac.
I won't disagree with you.
I will fight every Apple fanboy who comes my way.
Well, I am not an Apple fanboy.
Superior hardware.
I am a slave to Apple. And I'll admit that. Right? Somewhat unwilling. I've gotten so tied into their ecosystem that I'm trapped. You know, it's like a spider's web.
And that's why you don't
I mean,
play
once I get
RTS video games on PC. They will never be released.
Well, that's because I don't play.
Yeah, like.
You don't have time.
I don't play games on the computer. I have consoles, which I know is
Yeah, but you didn't have it.
I only played it once.
I told you you needed to get it, and you kept saying don't get it.
It's great though. I mean, I've
You
done
gotta
like
get
all
into the
nighters.
Crusader.
It's a fantastic game.
I play it with my 13-year-old son.
Does it
It's
really?
great.
I totally forgot.
So. Okay. Sorry for the pulling down the mouse.
We're all dead now.
Oh, I never saw your green screens today. I'm assuming
Yeah, I
everybody
was
had one.
wondering if you were.
I'm sorry, Val. Please don't tell anybody that.
This, you know, yes.
You know, can we
For
just,
the record,
for one
everybody,
second,
I-
can we talk about how
For the record,
absolutely
everybody,
useless the green
I just want you to know I'm okay.
Well,
All
look at
right.
this. All right.
I'm okay today.
That's right.
All right. I mean, we've all been exposed to each other for more than 15 minutes, right? So we're all screwed.
Like an hour and a half.
We're all screwed if we have COVID. All right. So I just wanted to look in the 35 minutes we have at a couple of voices from the beginning of our and in fact, this goes a little earlier than but just to give us an initial kind of marker of what's going on in the world circa the mid to late 14th century. Has anyone encountered Ibn Battuta before? Derek, who is he?
He is a Moroccan, born to a Moroccan family of lawyers, experts, and he ends up spending 4 years traveling around primarily the Near East, Africa, and parts of Southeast Asia, before returning to Morocco, conducting a little bit more travel, compiling it into this travels of Buddha, and it's kind of like a general overview of it. He's very famous as an explorer, not really an explorer, but a well-known travelogue.
This is an interesting genre of literature that we find in the late 13th, 14th, 15th century. It starts with figures like Marco Polo in the 15th century. But also, there's a Jewish fellow named Benjamin Flagler in Spain who it seems traveled throughout the Mediterranean and the Middle East with this. And they wrote these travel accounts, right? There's a 15th century text by an Englishman named John Mandeville, which is supposedly a travel account, but really I think John Mandeville wrote all of that while he was sitting in his room in London or whatever. I don't think he actually went anywhere because he gets into, and he bases it on stuff he's read in bestiaries and looking at maps of different parts of the world. Medieval maps in Europe tended to show like strange creatures at the margins of the maps, right? And so he claims to have traveled to the kingdoms of Gog and Magog and encountered figures like, anybody ever read the Chronicles of Narnia? So in the Voyages of Dawn Treader, you have like the Delphic and anyway, he encountered all of these characters that are common somewhere in the world. The Ceopods, as they're called, the Blemi, who had their faces on their chests and no head, the Canocephaly, the dog-headed people. Anyway, he finds all of these characters at the edge of the world where he locates the kingdom of Prester John, who was this legendary figure kind of circulated in intellectual circles, not the actual book, but the idea of him, circulated in intellectual circles starting in the 12th century in Europe. Right? So these are fantastical accounts. It's even been, argued, I think, convincingly that Marco Polo made up most of what he said. That he may have made it as far as Persia, but heard about China, heard about the court of the Great Khans, and didn't actually travel there, but claimed he had, right? So gained notoriety back in Italy. Ibn Battuta likely did travel to most, if not all, of these places. To fabricate some of this, well, it's entirely possible. But beyond that, of all of the traveler accounts of the late Middle Ages, this one covers the most territory by far, and seems to know a great deal about each place, indicating its probable authenticity. He finished his travels in the 1350s and wrote the accounts down somewhat after that. And so the actual writing down of the accounts occurred right at the beginning of our period, but the period of travel was before this. Okay. I just want to look at a couple of passages here. All right. The first one's this. This is the beginning of the work, okay, where he's in Egypt. His travels begin in Egypt. He's headed on pilgrimage to Mecca. He's a Muslim after all. And he goes to Alexandria and meets some of the Muslim holy men who live in that city. One of the greatest saints in Alexandria at this time was the learned and pious Imam Burhan-ud-Din al-Araj, a man who had the power of working miracles. One day I went into him when he said, "I perceive that you are fond of traveling into various countries." I said yes, although I had at that time no intention of traveling into very distant parts. He replied, "You must visit my brother Farid-ud-Din in India and my brother Rokn-ud-Din ibn Zakaria in Sindhia, and also my brother Burhan-ud-Din in China. And when you see them, present my compliments to them." I was astonished at what he said, and determined with myself to visit those countries, nor did I give up my purpose till I had met all the three mentioned by him and presented his compliments. what's interesting, or I might even say remarkable, about this little vignette that gives of meeting someone else?
One man, Alexander, has relatives that he knows in vastly geographically distant places in the world, which speaks to both the impact of Islam on Near East, Central Asia, as well as the world, and also the amount of knowledge that was of how big the world was.
Yeah.
We often don't consider.
Right. I mean, in Europe, still at this point, certainly in the 13th century, the world was, the idea of a world geography existed in the realm of theory for the most part, right? And kind of the world of symbolism, okay? Medieval Europeans envisioned the world like this. This is called a TO map. And this is east, because we know that all maps have east on the top. So they did in the pre-modern world. Okay? That's what we say to orient oneself, right, means to find up on a map. Okay? Because orient means, if you go to Latin, what does orient mean? East. You find east. Okay, so east was the top of the maps. So this is Asia. This is Europe, and this is Africa. And the actual outlines of the areas are of lesser importance, right? They didn't care what the coastline looked like, or what the shape of these things were, okay? This was symbolically important, and there were geographic markers. Right? What separates Asia from Africa and Europe? It's the Nile River, or the Red Sea. This would have been the Caucasus Mountains. Right? What's this? The Mediterranean Sea. What's right in the middle? No. Jerusalem. Right? Why does that have to be in the middle? Yeah, that's where Jesus came. This is the navel of the world, the navel of the universe, in fact, because the earth is a geocentric universe. So, a lot of symbolism. Dante talks about the structure of the earth. Symbolism continues in the interior with Inferno, and then the other side of the earth has the Mount of Purgatory on it, and so forth and so on. So that's how people thought about geography. It wasn't like these places where people lived and you could travel to, but it seems within Batuta we start to have that sense. That there are not just kind of theoretical or symbolic visions of people, but that these are actual places where people live, where people might travel to, where people might have relatives, where one might go and greet someone they were told about by someone who lived elsewhere. Now this seems a really obvious point, but, for the 14th century, this isn't that obvious. This is something quite new.
I was going to make a more prominent question, I guess, but I know that you mentioned earlier you're a medievalist, so you might have more knowledge on this, but would you kind of consider that the travels that led to it, that led them down, so that another step on the long tradition of Islamic writing on travel,
Yeah.
like in Scotland,
Right.
the early Middle Ages, travel.
Yes. Yeah, and so there are these antecedents, okay? I mean, Imvatuta is not entirely a pioneer in this way. And there is contained within both Islam and Christianity and Judaism to some extent an emphasis on travel, specifically to the places where they might do religiously important things. One of the key forms of penance for Christians in the Middle Ages, of course, is going pilgrimage. Now, if you went on a pilgrimage to a distant place, especially one with a really important saint or a set of relics, or maybe multiple saints, then so much more effective was that penance. Right? It's one thing for say an Englishman to travel to Canterbury and see the King of Becket, who's a recent saint, but it's so much greater to go to Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain, or to Rome, or to Jerusalem. It's not just one tomb, it's multiple tombs.
That's one of the things because it's like suffering to travel.
Yeah, that's right. It means that one rejects or sets aside one's earthly concerns for the sake of their soul. So it's a key point. In the Muslim tradition, in the Jewish tradition, it's, there's similar. I mean, we don't have saints per se, but there is this tradition of, especially older people, fulfilling a religious obligation, or at least a religious longing, by returning to the city gate, going to Jerusalem, going to the Holy Land, and living out the rest of their days. We have pictures who do that in some examples. Right, yeah. That's also 19th century case. The strivings are felt early. For the Muslims, travel is key. I mean, it's a religious obligation for everyone, except those maybe who don't have the means to do it, to go on Hajj, to go on pilgrimage to Mecca, at least once in their life. And if they're especially pious, they might do this multiple times. Right? And, Islam develops a religious topography that is similar in some ways to that of Christianity. Not quite so in your face, but there are, key religious sites, not just in Mecca and Medina, but throughout the Middle East. And even toward the end of our period, at least, in Eastern Europe and Balkan places like that.
Like you mentioned, how, in contrast to Christianity, where pilgrimage is something that, as you mentioned, Christian is often pursued or you were encouraged to do, it wasn't a specific requirement of the faith, whereas the Hajj in Islam is one of the seven pillars. It's like codified.
Yes.
Which probably, in some ways, is how you get a lot of these Islamic travel ops. Travel becomes ultimately an extremely important part of faith, and given that how Islam's rapid expansion to Asia, specifically here, that's how you end up seeing all these different peoples when you ride in Mecca.
Right.
India, China.
Well, in Islam, even more than Christianity, extends itself broadly, right, across many different geographies and many different regions. Christianity is prolific that way too, but here is part of Imbatu's account about going to China, and one of the things he says there is, well, this is a common occurrence for a Muslim. Now, this translation, I will say, is really old. Like, this thing was done in the mid-19th century, I think. So Mohammedan is the word the translator uses. This is unfortunately the edition that I have. So when any Muslim merchant, it should say, visits those Mohammedan towns which are among the Chinese, It is left to his choice whether he will take up his lodgings with a native merchant or whether he will go to an inn. If he prefers lodging with a merchant on an account of all he has is taken, and the native merchant is made surety for the amount who spends upon his guest just as much as is proper when the foreign merchant wishes to go, an inquiry is set on foot with respect to his property, and if anything is found to have been made away with, the merchant who was made surety makes it good by fine. So there is this Muslim infrastructure in China, right? A system of inns, Muslim quarters in Chinese cities, and even a system of laws to ensure that foreign merchants will have their goods protected as far away as China. You see that?
Oh, it
kind of finished there.
It was an off topic.
Okay. So, there are these networks that exist, right? Religious networks that are also tapped into the economic systems, the trading networks. Right? Another thing that Ibn Battuta brings up, and I'm kind of rushing through some of this because we have limited time here. When he goes to, well, what they call in Arabic, room. Okay, that's not a room that he goes into. Okay, this is an imitation of the Arabic word for Rome. But Rome doesn't mean Rome as in the city in Italy. It means, in this case, what? Constantinople. Okay. He says here that he goes to Constantinople in company with the wife of a sultan who happens also to be the daughter of the emperor of Constantinople. Now, the translator seems absolutely clueless. I looked through all the notes about who this actually was. I did not take the time to go and look this up and figure out what's going on here. Okay. But first of all, this introduces the possibility, or the existence, I should say, of people marrying outside the faith, even across long distances. Okay. The daughter of the Christian emperor of Constantinople ends up marrying a Turkish Muslim sultan. But what's even more interesting, if we read into their account, right, he goes to Constantinople with this queen, he calls her. Okay. And he writes, the queen had with her a mosque, which she set up at every stage just as her husband used to do. Now, what does that mean? That's right. It was a portable mosque. Okay. They carried this thing, and whenever it came time for prayers, as it does 5 times a day in the Muslim tradition, they would set up this mosque. She would go in and pray. Right? She's the daughter of the Christian emperor, but she's married a Muslim, so she has Muslim religious obligations. It seems she has converted to the faith. But this gets more interesting. In this, she had daily prayers. She left it, however, at the fortress. Now, this is the last Turkish Muslim outpost in Anatolia that they pass. She leaves the mosque there. She has in her company a muazzin. Anybody know what that is? This is the prayer caller, the one who announces when it's time to pray. You may have heard the Adhan before. Allahu Akbar. Announces it's time for prayer. So Ibn Battuta says, after this, the office of the muazzin ceased. Wine was brought into the banquet, and of this she drank. I was also told that she ate swine's flesh with them. Nor did one who prayed remain with her. Some, however, of her Turkish servants daily prayed with us. Thus were the tastes changed by entering into the territories of infidelity. So what did this woman do?
As soon as she wasn't in any danger of getting hurt or being a Christian, she
She went straight back to her old way.
That's one way to interpret this, or how else could it be?
She did not want to be. She was venturing into Christian land. She was a
Stop being the daughter of a ruler of that area. She was probably maybe the piece that she was raised on.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot going on culturally, socially, psychologically. We find here a woman caught between two worlds, but in a way, I mean, we could also find that she is expressing agency, that she can be both. Right? She can exist in both worlds. She can be both the daughter of a Christian emperor and the wife of a Muslim sultan. Okay? And be equally adept at both roles. Ibn Battuta, rather than be disgusted by her, I mean, he does express some disapproval. He puts his tongue a little bit, right? But he goes on to say she was really generous with me, and, you know, she made sure that I was safe when we got to Constantinople, and that I was introduced properly. And, you know, she is definitely the one in charge here. He is riding on her coattails, so to speak, okay? Her breast training. Proper medical. So, you know, here we have religion on the margins, or religion in a contact, okay? And the changeability of it. Literally changing one's clothes, okay, adopting a new persona when they travel from one region to another. Ibn Battuta doesn't feel the need to do that. Right? Everywhere he goes, he finds fellow Muslims. But here we have someone else who's opting for a very different way to respond to this multi-ethnic, multi-religious setting. The other voice that I think is really interesting, and chances are this is not going to pull up. Come on. I use the scanner on my phone. It's like a 5 megabyte file for zip pages. So that might be. Anybody encountered Petrarch before? Here, if you want to. Yeah, the information about him. That's okay. It's all right if you don't.
He's I know he's one of the Petrarch. Petrarch, I know, is a key figure for at the Advent of the Renaissance.
Yes.
And also, he's not actually from the classical period.
No. He is a 14th century. 1304 to 1374. And so he like Ibn Battuta, lived most of his life in the time before the period we're interested in. But at the very end of his life, he composed a series of letters. Now, letters were not, in the Middle Ages at least, personal correspondence solely. They were meant to be, they were expected to be widely circulated. So when one wrote a letter to another person, if they were a person of importance at the author, they would expect that the recipient would then make copies of this and send them to other interested parties. Letters are, in fact, one of the key genres of the entire Middle Ages. So Petrarch writes a letter, and this is curious, actually. He titles it To Posterity. That title alone is curious and important. So this isn't addressed to a specific individual. This is not an ad hoc thing. He's not trying to comfort a friend in the case of Abelard in the 12th century with this story of one happening, the account of his trials or calamities. He is not, trying to inspire his colleagues in some way, like we find with letters that become somewhat personal, like the memoirs of Hubert of Mouton, which is actually a letter. He's thinking not about anyone currently living, he's thinking about the future. One of the things that Europe seems to have discovered in this period is a sense of the passage of time. That things were different in times before now, and that the things we do might influence future generations, for good or ill. And that things will be different in the future. Okay. Now, for a modern person, this is an obvious thing. Like, yeah, duh. Right? Of course things were different then. And things will be different in the future. But this is largely realized, or becomes a concept, only in the 14th and 15th century. It's arguably one of the most important intellectual shifts of the whole Renaissance. But it goes beyond just the title. I mean, this whole letter is just teeming with kind of new and revolutionary ideas, right? Much more probably than Petrarch even realized. Yeah, I don't have time to do a whole lot with this. So, just as an example, Petrarch here is talking about, he's critiquing himself. Now, Petrarch was among the most accomplished intellectuals of the 14th century. He was sought after by just about everyone who was interested in intellectual pursuits, philosophy, and especially letters, like literature. Right? He was a poet of extraordinary abilities. I have heard it said about Petrarch that he made even Dante's poetry sound ugly. I'm not sure I entirely agree with that, right? But the guy could spin a yarn, with the best of them. Absolutely beautiful poetry, and prose as well. But he judges himself here, okay? He acts as like a literary critic of his own work. And this is not the only place he does that. I had a balanced rather than a penetrating intelligence, he says. One that was fitted for all forms of virtuous, healthy study, but was especially drawn to moral philosophy and poetry. In the course of time, I left the latter alone and took great pleasure in the Holy Scriptures, finding a hidden sweetness in them that I had once despised, and treating poetic writing as purely ornamental. Now, that sentence alone, there's so much to unpack. So let's try for the last couple of minutes. What's going on? Yeah.
I think the note I wrote down is that the whole letter, not just in this specific section, but in general, seems to be Petrarch's attempt to define or address his own legacy, which is why he's writing this towards the end of his life.
Yeah, this was written in the last 3 years.
And so this specific passage that you pointed out kind of points to something that we may find somewhat normalized in the modern context, in that he has lived this life of exploration of something he loved, in this case of letters, but he learns in his old age that he's becoming more and more preoccupied with religion. He's found God to an extent that is right. window dressing for the stuff that he's not discovered through the exploration of Scripture.
Right. And he holds this up against what standards? See, this is so different from the autobiographical account that was most known previous to this time. Okay. The most widely circulated autobiographical account, possibly in all of history up to this point at least, was what? Do you have any guesses? That's not autobiographical.
No.
No. An account written by a person of his own life. With kids. What did you say? That's not, I mean, we don't know if there was a Gilgamesh. Well, Petrarch likes that, okay?
I noticed that
Because he loves the Romans, and he loves the Greeks, right? He loves the histories. He loves Livy, he loves, especially Suetonius, you all know, Cicero. It would be Augustine's Confessions. And Augustine's Confessions is really a story of what? It's about a guy who says, I was sinful much of my life. Sinful in that I felt, sexual longing. Sinful in that I loved literature and philosophy more than I loved God. Sinful in that I stole pears from one of my neighbors. He's really broken up about it. As a teenager, he and some friends sneaked into an orchard and stole some pears. And they didn't even eat them. They threw them to the pigs. And they just did it because it was a wicked thing to do. And he still, 50 years later, feeling really guilty about that. This is all held up against this ideal of what it means to be a Christian. Right? And if you look at even the semi-autobiographical things we find in the Middle Ages, like the two I mentioned earlier, Guibert Monodier and Peter Abelard's Historical Anecdotum, while Abelard indulges himself a little bit and talks about how handsome he was when he was young and how brilliant he was as a teacher and as a philosopher, I mean, he's arrogant to the max, right? But when it comes down to it, he's like, well, all of this was fitting because God needed to teach me humility. But Petrarch doesn't do any of that. Petrarch just says, this is who I was, and this is what I like. These are my preferences. I did this because I liked it. I came around to Holy Scripture, not in the sense that I had this conversion, I eventually came to God and all of that, right? But because I found it to be sweet. I didn't think it was when I was younger, but I like it now.
Would you kind of argue that this is kind of shifting ideas into humanism and individualism?
Yeah, he is the torchbearer, right? The initial torchbearer of humanism. Absolutely.
I think what I thought was about the passage was just how much, you mentioned earlier, one of the things that emerges from learning experience, like individualism. Not that he's talking about myself, I didn't, I was.
Yep.
Talking about his own preferences, like you say.
Oh, yeah. And again, not as held up to some Christian ideal, but just this is who I am as a human being, right? I always dislike the age in which I live. To say that alone, right, is, it evinces this notion that this age is different from other ages. That is revolutionary thinking.
Well, you also say it's also kind of progressive. He's probably looking at the future in miles.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I've got to give an account of myself so that people will know what I was about and they can judge me, on different grounds than I am judging the past. Right? So a lot going on with Petrarch here. Maybe we can, we've got 2 weeks. We're going to be focusing on this, but I may come back to this at some point. I love Petrarch. Okay, I will see you in 2 weeks. And if you have questions, you want to meet with me, right? I have my office hours. And my apologies for the
They're all on,
botched syllabus
they're all on Zoom, right?
and all of that. Office hours are on Zoom unless you want to meet in person, in which I can make those arrangements if you like. Zoom
We
is
need
easy.
to wipe down our desks.
You should wipe down your desks. I'm going to wipe down everything like that. Take a minute to do that. You know, it's a good class when you like run out of time. You're like, man, I wish I had another hour. You know, you're probably not thinking that, but I am. So.
Well, we spent the majority of the class talking about the syllabus, which is about the
Yeah.
worst way to spend a class. But,
Oh, come on. I mean, we talked about like what we're gonna do in here at least.
yeah, I know. It's just like, you know.
We should.
obviously-
You're right. We should have given more time to Petra. That would have been good.
It's like, obviously, you feel like we should have another hour because the first hour of the class was spent talking about.
Let's spend it on logistics.
Not Petra.
Right.
What week are we gonna choose like who presents?